have David Sheff here today as one of is a beautiful boy. I read his Beautiful Boy, and I really feel it's part of the fabric of recovery. So it was really a good read and very educational. And as I was talking to you, it kind of helps to have someone like this, because you're in the daily life. And as you know, as a professional, this is a difficult job, and you really need to have someone like him have a different perspective, have someone that kind of intellect and coming from a different perspective. So I appreciate your books, and I'm very privileged to have you speak at our center.
Well, I'm so grateful to be here. I feel privileged to be here, and wanted to thank you for that introduction, and to thank Valerie Allen for all the work she does, and most of all, I want to thank you, everyone associated with the Pasadena Recovery Center, and also anyone in this field, just for the work you do. You're saving lives every day. Very briefly, for those who haven't read Beautiful Boy, my route here was circuitous. I never thought much about addiction. My image of addicts was one that is shared, unfortunately, shared commonly across our country. I had, when I would walk down the streets of many cities, where I live in San Francisco, in the Tenderloin district, people are homeless and sometimes psychotic in doorways, and that's what I thought it meant to be an addict. That's what an addict looked like. They certainly did not look like my son, my beautiful boy, Nick. He was born in Berkeley, and his mom and I had a parentless, lives, very selfish, sort of doing what we wanted to, partying a lot. And when we had a child, everything changed. Here was this, this being that had entered our lives, and it was this light and this beauty, and he would wake up in the morning just greeting the day with this openness, and it was just so transformative and so lovely being a parent, being a father, and I got it right away, and I really appreciated that. It didn't, we focused on our son, and we went to parks, and we went to, as he grew older, we went to the zoo, and we did all the things parents do. When he, his sort of unique personality emerged, he was just I'm his dad, what am I going to say? He was a lovely child. He had a very unique personality. When he was in kindergarten or first grade, the kids were asked to talk about themselves, whether they live in a house or an apartment, or whether they are, just about their families, what their parents do for a living, all those kinds of things. And one of the questions was, they asked, what color are you? And Nick very earnestly responded that he was beige. I guess this is significant in a way, because his earnestness and his kindness and his sometimes sort of, again, his life is hard sometimes, there were ups and downs, but he was a happy kid. And I was part of a generation that, my parents' generation, I think many of my parents, certainly mine were very different. I mean, they were great and loving parents, but they were very much disconnected from us. We were sort of off doing our thing most of the time growing up. They didn't know what was going on with me, so when my drug use began, they just didn't have a clue. They didn't pay enough attention to actually notice that maybe things were different and maybe things were worrying. But I was very part of this generation. We took parenting so seriously. We called it parenting instead of just having kids. It was like this. It was a very conscious thing. We tried to have this connection with our kids, and I think many of us did, and I felt that I had that connection with Nick. And as he grew older, you know, we look, as parents, we look to our children and we look to these external barometers to tell us how our kids are doing. And according to those, you know, Nick was doing great. As he grew up in middle school and then high school, at the beginning of high school, you know, he was a really, really good student, and he was involved, and he had a lot of friends, and he was a, you know, water polo player and swimmer and all this kind of stuff that, from the outside, made it seem that, you know, he was just doing great. And so when he was really, you know, he was 13 or something like that, I was getting him ready for a sleepover at a friend's house, and so I opened up his backpack and found a bag of pot. And I was completely blown away. I was just stunned. First of all, you know, he was 13, and it seems so young. So it broke my heart that, you know, it wasn't, I'm not naive. As I said, I grew up with drugs, I used drugs, and I'm aware of the cultural, sort of the culture around drugs, and I'm aware of the seduction of drugs. I understand about that. But still, I was surprised because he was so young. And then the other reason I was so surprised is because of, you know, what I said. I thought we were that close, that I would know what was going on with him. And suddenly I realized that he had this other life, and it was independent of me. And so I was worried, and I didn't do what a lot of parents do, which is to say to ourselves, you know, we kind of roll our eyes and listen to, you know, Nick said, oh, you know, my friend and I were curious, and we tried it, and I hated it, and I'll never do it again. That's what he said, and I think a lot of parents would be reassured by that. But I wasn't, and I went to see his teacher, and I went to see the school counselor, and I both told them about finding the pot and my concern. And they said to me what you know, basically what they said to me is, listen, you know, a lot of kids experiment. It's kind of a rite of passage. But you know, the main message was, listen, Nick's a great kid, and he will be fine. And that's exactly what I wanted to hear. And so I went home and assumed that, you know, everything was going to be okay. You know, both reassured by Nick and reassured by his teachers. But everything wasn't okay. His drug use very quickly escalated. I remained clueless most of the time. As his drug use, I now know that his drug use now escalated, so that by the time he was you know, a sophomore in college, even as he was still sort of this perfect kid, you know, kid, student, you know, great grades, all that kind of other stuff, you know, he was using, you know, psychedelics and ecstasy, and by the time the next year he was, you know, he was mixing all these drugs and drinking a lot, and then by the time he was a senior in high school, he used, again, I learned later that he used methamphetamine for the first time, and you know, there were these two things going on. I mean, we think about drugs. Maybe people, that's not true. I was going to say we think about drugs in a very simple way, that, you know, it's about getting high and feeling good, and that's this sort of selfish, sort of hedonistic thing going on. But anybody who's been through it, anybody who works with addicts, anybody who's addicted, been addicted, is addicted in recovery, knows that it's so much more complicated than that. And it was for Nick. Nick says now, and I look back and I can see it if I look deeper, if I look closer, but Nick now says that he struggled intensely as he was growing up, because he was presenting to me and his mom and his teachers this, you know, what we wanted to see, and he was really smart, and he was able to do that. And of course, he wasn't even conscious, you know, of all this stuff going on inside himself, but he did have what he now describes as this intense anxiety, and this feeling of separateness from the kids around him, this feeling of being alienated from his family. As much time as we spent together, as much as, you know, we have two other kids, his little brother and sister, Daisy and Jasper, he seemed so connected to them. And he was, but still there was this feeling that he had, and also this incredible reticence, and some sort of self-loathing. he said, I mean, he was this handsome, lovely child, and he thought he was ugly, and he felt that, in a social situation, he couldn't talk to, people at all, and especially, there'd be a girl that he'd been, eyeing for, in school, and he just couldn't talk to them. And he says that when he got high, that melted away, and that anxiety disappeared, and that that confidence was there, that intense shyness was there, and suddenly he felt connected to people. And that was when he started smoking pot. It was this whole relief. And but he said that it didn't last long. And so when finally he was getting high and it didn't do it for him anymore, whereas some people it's more accidental, it's sort of where you are in a situation, someone may hand you a pill or somebody may offer you a line of coke or something like that. For him, he said it was very different. He said that he actively pursued harder drugs because he wanted this stuff that was going inside him to go away. Much later, not until he was sober and in his 20s, was he finally diagnosed by a psychiatrist with bipolar disorder and depression. And now when he looks back, and when I look back at that period, he was trying to treat, these drugs were, he was trying to treat these sort of, teenage things, like, feeling like you can't talk to a girl or something like that, but also something very deep and profound. And he said that when he was using, it was sort of like this anxiety left, but there was something else that happened, and it happened especially when he started using, stimulants and cocaine, and especially when he started using crystal meth. He suddenly felt that it was something he'd never known, but he felt an absence of, pain. He felt an absence of a certain kind of pain because he didn't know that you could feel this way, and he felt suddenly, oh, this is what it's possible to feel like. At that point, he says that it stopped being about being high, feeling high. Maybe that's not completely true, but it was not the primary motivation for his continued use. It was that he had found medicine for a life of living with this internal pain that he was hiding from the outside. So in the meantime, I got worried at certain points of time, things would happen. But I'm a parent, and I've come to realize that we are wired for denial. We see what's going on. Nick he would act different. His friends changed. He would get sort of surly and spent less time at home. I didn't know where he was more often. I didn't know the friends he was hanging out with. He was more in his room. So I would get worried. But then one time he would come home. Well, first of all, I did talk to him, and again, he told me what I wanted to hear. I'm stressed, school, I haven't been sleeping because I have so much homework. Okay, well, I guess that explains. Looking back again, I know it's idiotic, but I listened carefully. And then he would come home from school one day, and Daisy and Jasper would be hanging out, and he would just sit there, their big brother, and they would be playing, horsing around with him and carrying him around and playing, building stuff with Legos and blocks and reading to them. And I would think, oh, he's fine, he's great, thank God. That reassurance, I would hang on to. And even if the other moments were so stressful and I was feeling so much intense worry, I would just hang on to those positive moments as a way to push everything aside. So that denial continued through those years until, I guess it was the very end of the senior year, maybe even at the beginning of summer. One night, Friday night, he was supposed to be home at midnight, and he wasn't home. And my first reaction was, it wasn't the first time he missed his curfew, and he's in trouble, he grabbed him. And then it was 12:30, and then it was 1 o'clock, and I started to worry more. Karen and I, my wife and I, were in the kitchen, and I got on the phone, and I called up his friends, the ones I had numbers for, and I called up his friends' parents to see if anyone knew where he was, and no one did. And I called up, eventually, you know, it was 2 o'clock, it was 3 o'clock, and again, anybody who's been through it, any parent who's been through it, or it's not just parents, a husband or a wife, or, you know, whoever it is, our minds, you know, spin out all the horrors of what could be happening, and this is where I was up, you know, where I was, you know, where is Nick? Where's my son? And so I picked up the phone and I called the police, the local police, to see if, you know, something had happened, or I called the local hospital emergency room, and no one had seen him. And then it was 4 o'clock, and it was 5 o'clock, and it was 6 o'clock, and it was a full night of terror. And at 7 in the morning or whatever it was, you know, Daisy and Jasper come prancing into the kitchen ready to start their day, and they see their mom and dad, who were looking. You know, there was no hiding it. We were freaked out, and you know, Jasper says, you know, where's Nick? And of course the answer was that we didn't know. And we endured that for another day, and then another, and it was more of those phone calls. You know, we tried to keep it together enough to take care of the other kids and get them to school and get them home and do whatever else we need, feed and get them fed. I mean, the basic. But in the meantime, we were just totally freaked out. I mean, where was Nick? I finally heard from him after enduring these hellish days, and when he called, he sounded terrible, and he told me where he was, and I got in the car and I drove to meet him, and when I saw him sort of huddled in the back of this dumpster behind this bookstore in San Francisco, near in San Rafael, near where we live, you know, there was no more denial. My denial vanished, because here was a person who looked as close to death as one could, who still could, you know, was conscious and breathing. And so I, you know, sort of helped him up, and it felt like he could break in two. He was so sort of brittle, and he was trembling and completely emaciated, and I got him in the car and he passed out. And so then I knew that we were in trouble. And so I got him home, I got him in his bed, and he passed out and he was asleep, and I got on the phone. And that's when I first began to, you know, be conscious of I learned what a disaster, you know, what a broken addiction care system we have in America, or what we call the system, what we call, and I learned that when you know, because I would call people, and you know, somebody would tell me, you know, I called the kid's school, I called the counselor at school, I called, you know, friends, and friends told me about their friends whose kids had been through this, and I called everybody I could think of, and I was told, you know, just everything. I was told to kick him out. People told me, and that was just one person, people who had been through it with their kids or themselves, they themselves, you know, were addicts in recovery, and they said, kick him out. That is the only thing that will help him. Kick him out, and, you know, face the reality of the situation, and you know, where he's going, until he, you know, hits bottom and crawls in essentially to you know, to beg to get help. You know, someone told me, you know, to send him to a boot camp, you know, a tough boot camp, you know, whatever, marching in the desert, as if, you know, that's what he needed. That'll straighten him out. And there are places, you know, I don't know, I pursued them, I looked online, there are places that say online, you know, send us your kid, and we will fix them and return them, you know, in 90 days or 30 days. And, yeah, that's what I wanted. Somebody told me, believe it or not, to send them to a rehab in Czechoslovakia. That, you know, was all about, you know, alternative treatments with herbs, and I didn't know. And one woman, you know, the I was, overwhelmed. All I knew was I had this time bomb waiting. Nick was going to wake up, and I had to figure something out. And so, one of the solutions that seemed reasonable and it seemed doable, right away, was this woman who told me that about a treatment program in San Francisco that had helped her son, who was a heroin addict, and she told me that he had been in recovery since then, and he was now actually working as a drug counselor. And so that sounded very hopeful to me. And I called the program, and they had a bed, and they took our insurance. And so I packed some of Nick's stuff up in a suitcase and went to very gently, wake him up. And I said to him, come on, that's where we're going. I found a place that can help you. And he sort of looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I don't need help. And I said, Nick, you almost died. And he said, that was stupid. I just was really stupid, and I took some drugs. I didn't know what they were. And I'll never do that again. I don't need, I won't, there's no, anyway. And I said, listen, you need help, and I found a place where they can help you. And he basically said, fuck you. He grabbed some of his stuff, and he left again. And it was another day, and another day of that same, intense worry. Doesn't get better, it gets worse every time. And I got on the phone again. I called the sheriff. I called, one of the times I called our local sheriff department, the officer who answered, who had heard from me by then a few times, said to me, Mr. Sheff, have you tried the morgue? And I hadn't, but I made that call. And no one had heard from him, and again, where was Nick? Where was my son? I finally did hear from him. He was in terrible shape again, and I went and I picked him up, and at this point, I just had called the treatment center and said we're on our way, and I just brought him there, and he was kicking and screaming and literally weeping and literally holding on to me as I left him there, and I left the program in this kind of big, scary, building, dark, Victorian in San Francisco. Nick, my son, didn't look like an addict, but a lot of the people that I left him there with did, in my naive or whatever it is, uneducated mind. And I got in the car, and I just was beside myself. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and I just wept. But I knew where he was. I slept that night for the first time in a long time, and I thought, as hard as that was, thank God, and I'll pick him up in 28 days, and he'll be fine, and we will go on with our lives. By then, he was planning to go on to college, and he'd been accepted at some good schools, and this little detour, these bad choices that he made, they're going to help him figure that out. And I picked him up in 28 days, and he was totally committed to being sober. He talked about the disease of addiction that he was educated about. I still didn't get it, but he was, he heard most, I think, one of the most profound parts of that treatment program that he told me about were other addicts, these guys who, were much older, who said to him, they just said to him over and over again that, when he would be in denial and say, yes, I messed up, and, my parents are, insane, they, are freaked out, and they think of it, I'm not an addict. And these, people who'd been in recovery for a long, long time, or had not been in recovery, actually, most of these people had been in and out of treatment, for many, many times, and some of them were in their, 50s, 60s, and they said, I was you. I was you. And he heard their stories over and over again, and he kind of got it, or at least he began to get it. And he came home, and again, I was so relieved. And Around 3 days later, he was gone again. I won't go into the details of what happened next, because anybody who's involved in this world knows it. It was 10 years. 10 years of this hell, of Dick being gone, and I didn't know where he was, and I was completely freaked out, and my wife was completely freaked out, and we did our best to try to take care of our littler kids, but we were barely able to function at all, and so they were completely. Daisy, my daughter, she was so little when this stuff was happening that in some ways we thought Jasper, who's a little bit older, was the one who would be most affected by this climate in our home of stress 24 hours a day, intense worry. But we thought she'd be protected because she didn't really know what was going on. But recently, actually no, she's now a junior in high school, but when she was much younger, actually, I guess she was in 7th or 8th grade, the kids were, again, this is another version of writing about their lives. And I could read it to get the exact words, but basically she said, when I was little, my life was about sort of glorious sunsets. We lived in the country near the bay above San Francisco, and it was about the glorious country and the oceans and swimming, and my brothers, my 2 older brothers, carrying me around on their shoulders, which I know she meant both literally and also figuratively. That's the kind of big brothers they were. So I lived with that, and then with hunched vampires in the corners.